Welcome everyone to Cosmopolitics. I'm Elise Labott, and I'm here with an old dear friend of mine who's really been my go-to for years and years on democracy, Larry Diamond at the Hoover Institution, who's has like 1,000 titles, but basically writes about democracy, both here and abroad. Welcome, Larry.
Thank you, Elise. It's great to be with you.
I think the first time I ever kind of met you or came in contact with you was during Iraq. And we were talking about whether there was a civil war in Iraq or not. And you taught me about like what to identify as the indicators that the country is going to civil war. I don't know that we're there yet, but maybe we'll talk about that a little later. But here today, we're talking about democracy in America and democracy really under threat here. And in reading a lot of your work, including in the Persuasion Substack, I really encourage everybody to check it out. I'm struck by how you've described this moment as a quote rapid slide into authoritarianism. So talk a little bit about what makes you say that and what's keeping you up at night these first few months of President Trump's second term.
Well, the most important thing is the weaponization of federal government power to punish enemies and perceived enemies and adversaries, and to try to deconstruct and undermine political opposition, and really to destroy institutions across the board. So there's been the war against the law firms, which has tried to bring law firms in the United States to heel so they won't take cases representing opponents of Trump and defend them in court, and so that they will agree, which some of them have done, to offer him tens of millions of dollars in pro bono legal services. There's the war on universities and the effort to humiliate them and bring them to heel and take away their federal funding, which is not just funding for the universities, it's funding for America's economic competitiveness, its scientific and engineering genius and advance, its ability to continue to lead technologically and therefore economically, and therefore, you know, any chance he has of quote making America great again. But of course, he doesn't see it that way. It's the war on racial minorities under the guise
DEI.
of battling DEI, which I think has become in many corporations and in many iterations and on many university campuses too much of an ideological project. But nevertheless, to say that there's nothing to be achieved by trying to promote diversity and a fair, milieu or a fair society, I think is a deeply misguided and ethically troubled project. But whatever it is, it's the use of power, intimidation, and fear to try to silence and disable opposition. And that is the hallmark of an authoritarian regime.
I want to get into Congress in a minute, but one thing and he's also doing it to the media, right? Whether it's lawsuits or it's trying to curtail a free press by kicking the Associated Press at first out of the briefing room and Air Force One and all that. Now, kind of just putting it in a regular pool with every single media organization, even though a lot of these media organizations rely on the wire services. Um, why do you think, and you've mentioned fear stalks the land. Why do you think law firms, media organizations, universities are not kind of banding together a little bit more and, saying that strength in numbers, instead of just capitulating?
Well, I can think of two immediate reasons, one more specific and one more general and psychological. The more general and psychological one, and I do think it's useful to just, for all of us to kind of go back to grade school and think about the phenomenon which some of us were fortunate enough never to have confronted, but I think many of us did, of a schoolyard bully and how a bully operates. And it's almost always a he. Well, psychologically, it can be a she now, especially on social media. But in any case, a bully tries to dominate and isolate their potential constrainers or adversaries and pick people off one by one. And if people don't band together, the bully prevails, the organized crime ring prevails, the emergent authoritarian regime prevails. But, if you're just thinking of yourself, your own institution, your own safety, you just want to duck for cover
Right.
and say, look, I'm not your problem. Look over there. Uh, you know, uh, you know,
I've been
Stanford is not going to
disappointed.
be your problem.
Right. I've been disappointed, frankly, that some of the law firms in particular, if the 10 biggest law firms got together and said, we're not going to stand for that. Instead, I think when Weiss capitulated, a lot of the others followed. And that was kind of disappointing. Talk about Congress. I know that there's a fear of being primaried, but I also think there's a little bit more of, you know, what it looks like in practice to be really fearful of your security. And I think some of the
Yeah.
members of Congress, including Lisa Murkowski, that's had the fear of retribution is very real. Have you heard any examples of that?
Yes. Well, so just to finish the first point, um, we see a lot of instances in the law firms, in the universities, in the media, in the business community, very crucially, and we're going to see it in other institutional realms of institutional leaders having to make an existential choice.
Mm,
Are we going to fight this, or are we going to try and duck uh, for cover and hope they'll look elsewhere? And if you don't hang together, if you don't remain unified within institutional realms and across them, uh, you're going to be dominated and reduced, and you're going to pave the way to a more rapid descent into authoritarianism. It's really a similar thing in the Congress. If all of the Republicans in the Senate who are deeply troubled by what's happening, or even half of them, would stand up together and say, we're not going to abide this, they could take control of the Senate. And the similar coalition of them could take control of the House. They wouldn't even have to uh, they wouldn't even have to change their political parties. They could just say, we will not be intimidated. We are conservative Republicans. We will remain that. But if you continue to threaten to, quote, primary us, please be aware we could skip the Republican primary and run as an independent Republican in the general election. And we'll meet you there and we'll beat you there. And many of them would beat them there. So there's a coordination problem among Republicans that I think is generated by two factors. One is the fear of political extinction because they haven't been able to adequately imagine the pathway of an uh, uh, independent run for reelection. But I think the money would come to support them. And then there is the fear of physical extinction and the death threats that they're getting. And if this were a normal administration, if this were a previous administration, we could be handing these death threats over to the FBI. We could be expanding the resources of the FBI to investigate these threats and even to provide Secret Service protection for some members of Congress who seem to be particularly threatened. But do you think this administration is going to offer any protection at all?
Probably not. um,
Yeah, so it's a serious problem.
all right. I want to talk about the elephant in the room that, the reality is that President Trump won decisively. Half the country, more than half the country voted for him, knowing, he kind of advertised this is how he was going to run things. You know, what does that tell us about America's relationship with democracy right now? Do you think that many Americans are, tired of democratic gridlock and inefficiency? And is there, something about getting shit done, so to speak, that makes this more kind of strongman leadership appealing? I mean, some of the instincts, that he campaigned on may seem appealing, but it seems like a lot of people, in some people's minds, there's no way to pursue those type of legitimate concerns without more of a strongman approach. And I feel like that's something that's happening around the world too.
So we would be at an even greater risk than we are in if Donald Trump were more competent as a political leader and if he had an agenda that was more promising in its potential to regenerate industrialization in the US
Right.
and grow the American economy. But he is so incompetent, and the policies he's pursuing of tariffs, for example, and the price increases for Americans, and the attacks on our base of scientific and technological research and development are so contrary to the goals he said he is seeking of, quote, making America great again, that I think he is bleeding political support. So, Elise, and I don't think it's likely he's really going to be able to turn it around.
But I
Your
mean, the
question,
question is, have democratic institutions kind of, remember when Biden was like, we need to show that democracy can deliver? Has democracy delivered? Or is that why, he said, I'm going to be a dictator? Is that why Americans kind of voted for him?
I think they did not vote for him because he said he was going to be a dictator. They voted for him because they thought he offered a better prospect of controlling inflation, generating more rapid economic growth, controlling illegal immigration, which I don't think the Democrats have taken seriously enough, and responding to the economic anxieties and insecurity of working Americans. So I believe that the Democrats have not met all of the country's expectations in terms of uh, economic performance, and I think there is a way out. There is a way for Democrats to offer something different, not just more of the same, but
Not just Trump sucks.
it can't just be we oppose Trump, and
Right.
it can't just be, we're going to do Build Back Better 2.0. I really think the answer in terms of a broad policy strategy is in the new book by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, Abundance. I think
Yeah, it's
this
a good book.
is the strategy that the Democrats need to really build back better and to grow the economy and to build housing and transportation for the vast segment of Americans who really are being underserved right now.
As I started in the beginning, I met you when I was working at CNN covering the State Department. We're talking about global democracy around the world. And I mean, we've talked a lot about how he's mimicking Orban's playbook. And it's not just about kind of democratic institutions, but also, government, business, media. Talk a little bit about, models around the world. Obviously Orban is one. That what similarities jump out you at you, and do you think Americans, I'd say more Trump supporters, because I think people that don't support Trump already see it, but why don't Americans recognize these patterns?
Well, because we're a somewhat insular nation and we don't study other countries very extensively.
True.
But uh, Orban is one model. I think there is a model out there, Elise, of illiberal authoritarian populism. Orban is the most visible,
Right.
avatar of it.
Yeah.
And they are trying to model him, but there's inspiration from Turkey and Erdogan. There's inspiration from Modi in India. I think Trump is now very infatuated with Bukele and Nayib
Clearly.
Bukele in El Salvador, and the way he just kind of built these mega prisons and threw anybody who looked like a criminal in jail with no due process. So I think there are many different models out there, but the challenge for us analytically is to identify the core elements of the generic model, and that's what I tried to do in my book, Ill Winds, when I identified the autocrat's 12-step program. You begin by denouncing the political opposition as illegitimate. And then very early on, you go after the media as fake news and disloyal to the country. And then you try and undermine the independence of the courts and marginalize their capacity to constrain you. And the same with the parliament or the Congress. And then you go on to civil society, the universities, the think tanks, independent organizations, and then the business community. You try and purge the civil service of people who are not slavishly loyal to you personally and your political party, and remake it into a partisan tool. You do the same thing with the state security apparatus, and pretty soon there are no constraints left. You control everything, and everyone who thinks differently is afraid to stand up and confront you. And what Americans need to understand in the universities, in the business community, in the media, and in religious institutions and so on, the further this goes on, the greater the danger that it will be impossible to stop. And the earlier that people rally to the defense of democratic principles and join in unity to constrain it, the better the chance of preempting the authoritarian project.
I want to get to what people can do in a minute, but this Schedule F purge, federal workers, in one sense, it seems like a fundamental restructuring of government. But the idea that every civil servant would serve at the leisure of the pleasure of the president would mean that in a real democracy we would be replacing the government every 4 years. But he's doing that, and I want to say, not it's not only him, because I think a lot of these things are the people around him, and he's just a vessel for some of this. Following over the years, there are certain things he's very strongly about, like tariffs or immigration. This is a lot like this Project 2025 that we read about before the election, but it does kind of suggest that they feel they're going to be in government for a long time if they're shaping the government to be in their image.
So, two things should I can say. One is that the Schedule F is a formula to simply go back to the spoils system in the United States before we had a professional and meritocratic civil service. Trump is infatuated with the word meritocracy, but it's not a meritocracy he wants, it's a plutocracy in which a slavishly loyal civil service will, serve his oligopolistic ends. So this needs to be resisted as a formula again for American decline, a less effective, responsive government, and a formula for basically disabling any constraints on power and any forms of transparency that would obstruct the pathway to crony capitalism and even more extreme corruption than what we've seen so far. And I would add, Elise, that Orban is their model in a second sense. When Orban came back to power in 2010, it was with a resolve that he had made a
Never,
mistake.
never lose again.
Yeah, he had made a mistake by allowing himself to lose in his previous single term as prime minister. And they all resolved, we're never giving this up again. And I think that is now the mentality of the MAGA movement. They have the moral right and imperative to rule. The left is decadent and corrupt, and they are going to rule forever. That's their attitude.
We keep waiting for, I think Republicans to reach some sort of, break glass moment with Trump. Are we fooling ourselves? What might actually trigger meaningful resistance from the party? And, to add on that, is there any way in your mind to wrestle him away from MAGA to back to a more conservative Republican agenda?
Well, to answer your second question first, the biggest constraint on Trump, I think, will be the markets and the performance of the economy. Look at how quickly he backed away from tariffs, or at least the universal 25% generic tariff. It was the rapid decline in the stock market and the volatility in the bond market and the decline of the dollar that frankly freaked them out. So that is one constraining factor. And if the performance of the Trump administration on objective indicators of economic prosperity, war and peace, the ability to get, negotiated agreements and so on, keeps tanking, it is imaginable. I don't think it's particularly likely, but it is imaginable that the somewhat more reasonable and ideological elements of the administration, and that would include Marco Rubio and Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, might gain the upper hand. But I think it's more likely to just be continued chaos. And how this ends, expeditiously, I don't know, because he's still got 3 years and 9 months in his term. In terms of the break glass moment for Congress, we will see what happens if he defies a Supreme Court ruling. That should be the break glass moment. And if he blatantly defies the Supreme Court ruling and says, you don't matter, I'm not going to honor your decision, how many troops do you have? That's it. That will be the test of American democracy. And if the Republicans don't in the House and Senate don't defect at that point, then we're on a rapid slide to, I'd say, a clear form of authoritarian rule.
Do you envision that happening?
I think it is imaginable, but it's also imaginable that he won't do it or he won't get away with it. A lot will depend on the reaction of the business community, civil society, and so on. People need to stand up. They need to really, put the national interest above their individual, personal, or institutional interest, and
Americans
realize,
Americans have never really been like that. Like I look at a country like Ukraine where, I feel like if I don't know if we got it, I don't think we were in the same place as we were during 9/11 when the country got together. But I don't know that the kind of the unity and the patriotism and the nationalism exists in this country.
Well, we have plenty of, examples in history of the country rallying in a more unified fashion, both to face an external challenge, as in World War II, or to defeat an incipient autocrat, namely Nixon, in the Watergate era, and ultimately to defeat McCarthy as well, after too many people cowered in fear. So there are examples, but we are seeing a lot of self-regarding behavior right now. And I am very struck by the comment of a Chinese emigre to the United States, a young Chinese emigre, a very committed Democrat who's decided he wants to be here and not in China because he wants to live in a democracy. And he's looking at the situation we have in the United States now and just rolling his eyes. And he just nailed it from my view as a democracy scholar. He said, what is needed is unity and coordination. And people should not essentially, following the first principle of Timothy Snyder's book on tyranny, people should not obey in advance. Don't offer this aspiring king more cooperation than is absolutely required by the law.
I mean, he said in this recent interview, I run the country and the world. But I think what was more telling was when it was something small about congestion pricing in New York. And he kind of put on Twitter, I've gotten rid of congestion pricing, long live the king. And I thought that was a little bit more telling. And there is a little bit, I feel like, of a messaging movement from the White House to try and set it up like that. I have two last questions for you as we kind of come to a close here. People are a lot of people are sitting home. They think they're hopeless. Some people are, that don't agree are saying this is partisan hand wringing or overreaction. With so many fronts to defend, how can concerned citizens focus their energy? Governor Pritzker has called for mass mobilization, street protests. Are there smarter ways for the public to push back? If someone's at home feeling helpless, what practical steps can they take?
Well, I'd say definitely join a community protest. I think their voice needs to be heard. And I'd say this sounds so trite, but honestly, I've been told over and over by people on the inside, including in Congress, it makes a difference. Call your member of Congress, particularly if they are, enabling rather than opposing what
We've
Trump
seen
is
these town
doing.
halls. It
Yeah.
seems like
The
it's
town
great.
halls, but also the person, at the desk of the member of Congress in the Capitol, receiving the call and logging in what's being said. Flood the zone. And if you're part of an institution, whether it's a community organization, a university, a law firm, a business, uh, insist that the institution stand up for principle and not, to quote Timothy Snyder again, obey in advance.
One of our listeners, Lisa, asked, "What does America look like after a slide into authoritarianism?"
It looks somewhere between Hungary, soft authoritarianism, and Turkey, no longer soft authoritarianism. It will be ugly, it will be fearful, and it will be economically disastrous. But I'm hopeful that we're not going to get there. I think we are aided, maybe more than we deserve to be aided, by the incompetence of Donald Trump and his administration, and I think that's going to be part of their undoing.
Larry Diamond, Hoover Institution, Stanford University. Read his book. Read his writings on persuasion. This short half hour is just a taste of some of the really thoughtful writing and speaking that he's doing. And Larry, it's really always great to talk to you, and look forward to doing it again soon.
Oh, thank you, Elise. Take care, everybody.
Thanks very much. Bye bye.
Don't despair. Bye bye.